Walter Kane had been blind for 15 years. He had lost his sight in a roadside explosion in Kandahar province in October of 2009, a Tuesday morning that he remembered in complete sensory detail up to the moment the light went out. And then in complete sensory detail again from the moment he woke in the field hospital. The smell of antiseptic and canvas, the sound of generators and distant helicopters, someone's hand on his arm, a voice he did not recognize saying his name. He had been 26 years old. He had been married for 14 months to a woman named Rosalind, who had been at their apartment in Fayetteville, North Carolina, when she received the call, and who had driven to Walter's parents' house afterward and sat in their kitchen for 4 hours before she could stand up. He had learned the world without sight, with the same methodical patience he had applied to everything in his military career. And he had built a life that was full and purposeful, and that contained, in its architecture, the permanent absence of Rosalind, who had left 5 years after his return. Not from cruelty, but from a fracture that had been building since the hospital. And that had finally, quietly, irreparably given way. He had not spoken to her in 10 years. He had not heard her voice in 10 years. On the afternoon when Steve Harvey said, "Walter, turn around," and the voice that came from behind him was the voice he had not heard for 10 years, Walter Kane stood completely still for 6 seconds. Then, he said, in a whisper that the studio microphone caught, and that 275 million people would later hear, "Rosie." It was a Wednesday in November, taping day at Imageworks Studios in Atlanta. Walter had come with his sister Denise, her husband Malcolm, his army friend and closest companion Ray, and Ray's wife Sandra. Walter was 41 years old. He used a white cane with the ease of a man who has integrated it completely into his physical vocabulary. He was a certified adaptive fitness trainer, running a program at a VA hospital in Raleigh that served veterans with disabilities. He was also, by every account of everyone who knew him, one of the calmest and most grounded people in any room he entered. The specific equanimity that develops in people who have had the things they relied on removed, and who have rebuilt from something deeper. Denise had applied to Family Feud. She had done it, she later admitted to producers, because Walter had become so focused on helping other people recover that she was not entirely sure he was attending to his own life, and she had thought that a day off, in a different room, doing something purely for the pleasure of it, might do him good. What she had not known, when she submitted the application, was that the production team would make 3 calls over the following 6 weeks that would result in an arrangement that Denise would not learn about until she was sitting in the studio green room 40 minutes before the taping, and a producer had sat down across from her and told her quietly what was going to happen and asked if she thought Walter was ready. Denise had been quiet for a while. Then she had said, "I think he's been ready for years." Rosalind Kane, she had kept his name, which she had never explained to anyone, and did not explain when the production team contacted her, was 40 years old and lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. She was a speech pathologist. She had remarried in 2018 and divorced in 2020. She had 2 daughters from that marriage, ages 5 and 7. She had built a life that was, on all visible measures, a good one. Purposeful work. Children she loved fiercely. A community of friends. A church she attended every Sunday, and she carried, in a specific part of herself that she had been managing for 15 years, the guilt and grief and love and loss of having left a man who had needed her, and whom she had not been strong enough, at the time, to stay for. She had reached out to Walter's sister Denise 6 months before the taping. She had sent a letter, 3 paragraphs, saying she thought about him often and that she hoped he was well. Denise had not told Walter about the letter. She had called Rosalind. They had spoken 4 times over 4 months. And then Denise had told Rosalind about the Family Feud application, and Rosalind had said, quietly, "Do you think he'd want to see me?" Denise had said, "I think he's been wanting to for 10 years. I just don't think he knows how to say it." Rosalind had said, "Me neither." Nobody in that studio knew any of this. The game had been running well. Walter had been extraordinary, answering by instinct and pattern, his auditory processing so refined that he caught game show cues faster than most sighted players. The audience had responded to him immediately, and Steve Harvey had been at his most natural around Walter, unperformative, genuinely engaged, curious about the man rather than the circumstance. Between rounds 1 and 2, Steve had asked Walter how he navigated the board without sight. Walter had said, "I listen for the category. I think about probability, and then I trust the first thing in my head." Steve had said, "That's also how I host." The audience had laughed. Walter had smiled. But nobody in that studio knew what was standing behind the door at the back of Studio A. Between rounds 3 and 4, Steve Harvey stopped the game. He walked to Walter's position. He said, "Walter, can I ask you something personal?" Walter said yes. Steve said, "Is there someone you've been wanting to hear from?" Walter was still for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that had learned over 15 years not to carry more than it needed to, "Yeah, there's someone." Steve said, "Can you tell me about her?" Walter said, "She left. It wasn't her fault. It was the war, really. The war just had a longer reach than either of us planned for." He stopped. "I don't hold it against her. I held on to it for a long time and then I let it go. But I still think about her voice. I can still hear it exactly." Steve Harvey said, "Walter, turn around." The footsteps came from the back of the studio. They were Rosalind's footsteps, and Walter Kane heard them and knew them before she had crossed half the room. 15 years. He heard her footsteps and his body recognized them before his mind had finished processing the command to turn around. He was already turned by the time the instruction had fully registered. She was 12 feet away. Then 8. Then 4. Walter said her name in a whisper that the microphone caught, and that was the quietest sound the studio had produced all day. He said Rosie, and the word had 15 years in it. Not bitterness. Not accusation. Just the specific grief and relief of a word that has been held a long time and is finally being given back to the person it belongs to. Rosalind stopped when she reached him. She said, "Hi, Walter." He said hi. And then she put both her hands on his face, the way she used to. He said later, the same hands, the same gesture, before the war, before everything, and he pressed his hands over hers, and they stood at the center of the Family Feud stage, and were not on a game show. Steve Harvey had walked to the edge of the stage and sat down on the floor. He sat with his back to the cameras, his shoulders moving, for 2.5 minutes. He was not composing himself. He was not managing his appearance. He was simply a man in a room where something too large for television had happened, and he was sitting with it on the floor because that was what it required. When Steve stood, he turned to the cameras and said, "I'm not going to make a speech right now. Some things don't need framing. This is one of them." He waited. He let the room hold what it was holding. Then he said, "Walter, I want to tell you one thing. You said the war had a longer reach than either of you planned for. I've been thinking about that since you said it." He paused. "The love had a longer reach too. That's why she's standing in front of you." Walter Kane's head dropped. He nodded, once, slowly. Steve pulled out his phone. He called a veterans family support program he had worked with for 4 years, which specifically provided counseling for veterans with disabilities and their families navigating relationship reestablishment. He arranged, live on the stage, for 4 funded sessions for Walter and Rosalind, with a specialist who understood the specific context of military-related disability and the relationships that fracture in its wake. He said, because what broke was not simple, and what rebuilds needs to be handled with care. He announced both families would receive the full day's prize. He looked at Denise, who had been standing at the podium with her hand pressed flat against her chest since the moment the door opened. He said, "You did this. You made this possible." Denise said, "I just sent an application." Steve said, "That was enough." The episode aired 7 weeks later. The 6 seconds of Walter Kane standing still before he said Rosie's name, 6 seconds of a blind veteran recognizing a voice he had not heard for 10 years, was viewed 275 million times in 11 days. The hashtag, #TheVoiceHeld, was used in 39 countries. 3 veteran support organizations cited the clip in the following year's advocacy campaigns. The VA system in North Carolina reported a 40% increase in veteran family counseling referrals in the month following the broadcast. 3 months after the taping, Walter and Rosalind had met privately 6 times. They had not made any decisions about what they were rebuilding, because they had agreed that the decision was too large to rush and that they were both, finally, old enough to know that. They had had dinner twice. They had taken a walk along a river trail in Charlotte that Walter knew from his adaptive running group. Rosalind had described the view, and Walter had said, "You're still good with words." She had said, "I'm a speech pathologist." He had said, "I know." I always thought that made sense. A year after the taping, Walter and Rosalind had not remarried. They were still figuring out what they were to each other, which is its own kind of answer. Walter had met Rosalind's daughters. The older one had asked him, with the directness of a 7-year-old, "Can you see anything at all?" Walter had said, "I can see the important stuff." She had said, "What's the important stuff?" He had said, "The things I can hear." She had thought about it and said, "That's actually a pretty good answer." Walter had said, "I've had 15 years to work on it." Walter Kane still trains veterans at the Raleigh VA. He still uses the same cane. He still answers by instinct and pattern and trusting the first thing in his head. He has added one thing to his practice. At the end of every training session, he asks the veterans in his group to name one sound they are grateful for. He says it is not a therapeutic exercise. He says it is just a way of paying attention. He says paying attention is the whole job. If this incredible story of a voice across 15 years, and the man who trusted it the moment he heard it, touched your heart, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this with someone who believes it is never too late to hear the right voice again. Have you ever recognized someone before you could explain how? Share your story in the comments. Because as Walter Kane proved, some things the eyes never needed to see, the ears always knew.